Hello and welcome to Inside the Americas. I'm Angela Diffley. Our top stories this week: with the controversial Trump-era immigration policy known as Title 42 set to expire on the 11th of May, officials are bracing for a major influx of migrants at the US-Mexico border. Donald Trump is to appeal after being found liable of sexual assault in a department store in the early 1990s. And Brazil's President Lula da Silva signs a decree stipulating a quota of 30% of black people in the high-level so-called positions of trust in the civil service. Well, first to the United States, and US authorities are bracing for a surge in illegal migration along the southern border in the next few days. A Trump-era policy that allowed for officials to quickly return migrants to Mexico is set to end late on Thursday. That could put pressure on an already fragile asylum system. Well, with more on that story, this from Cabby Knight.
After hours of waiting, tensions rise outside these immigration offices in Tapachula in the south of Mexico. They've come in their hundreds from the border with Guatemala, in a hurry to cross the border into the US before Friday.
We need to go as fast as possible.
I heard on the news that they were going to close the border and that we had to get through before May 12th.
Many are misinformed and think they'll no longer be able to enter the US after Thursday. But what Title 42's expiration actually means is the end of a policy that allowed authorities to quickly turn away migrants at the border. So while some fear that applying for asylum may become more difficult, that's not what's worrying US authorities. They're bracing for a surge in illegal migration, which could exacerbate an already challenging humanitarian crisis. In places like San Diego in California, border staff are already out of their depth. Hundreds of migrants have been waiting here for days, stuck between two checkpoints. To help border police, the Biden administration has planned to deploy an additional 1,500 active duty troops to assist the National Guard. Texas's governor has also taken matters into his own hands and announced the deployment of a new unit.
They will be deployed to hot spots along the border to intercept, to repel, and to turn back migrants who are trying to enter Texas illegally.
Homeland Security says migrant crossings could reach up to 10,000 per day once Title 42 is lifted.
Well, as we heard there, adding to the confusion surrounding the end of Title 42 is this scourge of misinformation driven by traffickers trying to convince people that now is the best time to reach the US. Well, I'm joined now by France 24 journalist Peter O'Brien. Hi, Peter. Thanks for joining us. Try and give us a bit more detail on this. First of all, what exactly is Title 42 for those trying to cross?
So it's a nickname for a public health order issued by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that was near the start of the pandemic under Donald Trump's presidency. Ostensibly, it was to turn people away who had COVID-19, prevent them from reaching the US, but in effect, it was just used to turn away people en masse, full stop. And this continued into the Biden administration. Multiple crossings by the same migrants surged because there were no longer any legal repercussions for trying multiple times to cross. But now, with federal COVID restrictions finally lifted, it's the end of the road for Title 42. And we can tally up the numbers. So if we look since March 2020, migrants have been expelled 2.8 million times under Title 42. Meanwhile, about 1.8 million have actually been admitted into the US, but that's pending legal proceedings on their immigration status. Meanwhile, only tens of thousands have actually been granted asylum. But it's what's happened to those who were expelled under Title 42, which was the most controversial. The American NGO Human Rights First says that since Biden took office, it's documented more than 13,000 cases of rape, kidnapping, murder, and torture against people blocked or expelled under Title 42.
So when this expires, what actually is going to change?
Well, things will be like they were before, but a bit different. So when they arrive, migrants will once again be able to apply for asylum. They'll be able to have their cases dealt with through the legal system, although this, of course, will take years. And while the initial processing of migrants under Title 42 took just a matter of 10 minutes, now we're looking at it taking over an hour or more, which is obviously going to be a problem for these overcapacity processing centres. And the truth is, things aren't necessarily going to get easier for migrants either. Officials are expected to continue fast-track deportations under a scheme which is so-called expedited removal. And crucially, a new bit of regulation means that migrants who have gone to other countries on their way to the Mexico-US border, most of them will actually be barred from applying to asylum.
And what does this mean for Joe Biden politically?
Well, even the president has admitted that this transition from Title 42 will, quote, be chaotic for a while. Those are his words. This doesn't necessarily inspire confidence for those on either side of the aisle criticising the administration's preparedness for this transition. And polls show that in recent days, Joe Biden's public approval has dropped to around 40%. That's close to the lowest of his presidency. That's, of course, because immigration is a massive thing for a lot of American voters, rather, and next year we'll have another presidential election where he's rerunning. Republicans claim that Biden is laying out the welcome mat, although the Department of Homeland Security insists that the border remains shut. Democrats, meanwhile, have widely condemned this new measure that I talked about, preventing people from seeking asylum if they've been to a third country which isn't Mexico. They, as well as immigrant rights activists, say applying for asylum is a human right.
OK, thanks very much. Peter Bryan there, giving us a little more clarification on that Title 42. Time for some other news now, starting with Donald Trump's reaction after a court found that he had sexually abused and then defamed the author E. Jean Carroll and must now pay her damages. Emerald Maxwell has the news roundup.
The verdict is in. A jury's found Donald Trump sexually abused E. Jean Carroll in the 1990s and then defamed her. The magazine writer left the courthouse with a broad smile on her face following the 2-week trial. The former US president called it a disgrace, claiming to have, quote, absolutely no idea who this woman is. Trump's team says he will appeal. He's been ordered to pay $5 million in damages as he campaigns to retake the White House in 2024. The UN says more than 600 people have been killed in Haiti in April alone, in a new wave of extreme violence in the capital, Port-au-Prince. Here, Haitians are protesting for a higher minimum wage and, above all, for more security.
We have come here to change the country, to demand security. They rape us, they beat us on the way to work or after work. We need security restored in the country.
Rape, kidnapping, score settling. The UN says the chaos is getting worse in the poor Caribbean nation, with gangs now controlling most of the capital. Haiti's been gripped by political and economic crisis since the 2021 assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. Chilean voters have given right-wing and far-right parties a majority in a vote to elect committee members to draft a new constitution.
It was Chile, not us, who defeated a failed government.
A progressive government led by Gabriel Boric that has so far led efforts to replace Chile's dictatorship-era constitution. Nearly 80% of Chileans voted to draft a new constitution in 2020, following violent protests against inequality. But many voters found the progressive new text too polarising.
I want to invite the Republican Party, that's won an unquestionable majority, not to make the same mistakes that we did. This process can't be about vendettas, but putting Chile and its people first, before personal or party interests.
The future of the reform now looks uncertain, in the hands of parties reluctant to change Pinochet's neoliberal framework, and with voters now more concerned about the struggling economy.
Well, it's a measure that went almost unnoticed in Brazil. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva signed a decree stipulating a quota of 30% of black people in the high-level so-called positions of trust in the civil service in Brazil. In Brazil, although blacks represent more than 50% of the population, Lula says that despite the nation's status as the second most black nation on the planet, the country has not settled its accounts with 350 years of slavery. This report by our team on the ground.
In Brasilia, in the district of the ministries, it's like a uniform. Business ties, suits and white skin. In a country where more than 50% of the population is black, here in the heart of power, the elite looks very different from the society it supposedly represents. Anna Venturini is the director of affirmative action policy at the newly created Ministry of Racial Equality. She organised a meeting on this subject. The room is full of black people in high positions, an exception that she wants to turn into a general rule.
This decree came about with the specific objective of targeting high-level public service positions, which are not accessible through the quota policy. The quota law provides for places in federal public competitions in general. But what we found out through a survey by a research institute is that there are no quotas for the so-called positions of trust, of decision, to which the public entrance exams do not apply.
A glass ceiling that needs to be broken at university level. In Brazil, since 2012 in the government of Dilma Rousseff, universities have applied quotas for black, mixed race, indigenous and socially disadvantaged students. But the longer you study, the less this diversity is felt. And at the doctoral level, no national quotas are imposed. Each institution can decide for itself. Rio's Federal University was one of the pioneers of quota policies.
The final objective is that the policy of quotas becomes obsolete, that we finally have a representation of the diversity of society in its entirety in all doctorates.
What we need is for this new elite to give wings to young people who are starting to study, for them to be able to say to themselves, I can do it.
Placing people who have suffered discrimination at the heart of power will enable them to act better to help future generations.
The governments have set an ambitious target. They hope that by the end of 2026, 30% of senior civil service positions will be filled by black Brazilians.
And that's it from me. Jeannie Godula will be back in this seat next week. Until then, take care.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Good, thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.